Hello and welcome back. This is the American Patriots Channel, and I'm Jeff Penrod, your host. At the end of this episode, I'm going to give you some information about how you can be a little bit happier in your life, have a little less stress and a little less anxiety about everything that's going on around us. Today's episode is about the media. When I was growing up as a boy, I had a favorite TV show, and that show was Superman. Now, many of you may not remember it or haven't seen it because it has been a long time ago. One of the things I liked the most about the show was the honesty and integrity of the characters. Sure, there are some bad guys, but Superman usually dealt with them. And the theme of the show was truth, justice, and the American way. And that really seemed to fit the way things were back then. It seems that a lot has changed since back then, particularly in the area of truth, justice, and the American way. The media today seems to have lost its way when it comes to truth. It seems to not be able to wrap its hands around the truth. And when it comes to justice, it seems to want to degrade and demonize other people who don't share its opinion and not treat them justly. So, in a way, the media is no longer following the American way. Now, today we're going to be talking mostly about the mainstream media, although a lot of what we have to say will apply to the social media as well. The thumbnail that I chose for this episode is entitled Instruments of Mass Deception. And unfortunately, more often than not, it seems that that's a good description of the mass media today. When you talk about the news, you have to consider it kind of in quotes because the news is a lot of times not realistic. In fact, you hear the words fake news a lot of times because the news is not reliable. It's not factual. In fact, it's opinionated and distorted in quite a few different ways. There was a Gallup poll that was conducted recently, and 80% of the respondents said that the media is trying to manipulate people's beliefs. So the media is not only having trouble sticking to the truth, they're actually trying to manipulate what we believe. They're trying to trick us. There was an expert, a world-renowned expert on propaganda, and this expert said this about manipulation. They said, through clever and constant application of propaganda, people can be made to see paradise as hell, and also the other way around, to consider the most wretched sort of life as paradise. A little bit later in this video, I'm going to reveal who it was that said that, but rest assured that they are a world-renowned expert when it comes to propaganda. But the question is, well, what is propaganda exactly? Well, here's a definition. Propaganda is communication that is intended to influence an audience and further an agenda. The information that is presented is typically distorted in various ways, such as presenting some facts while omitting others. That's what I call telling one side of the story. Representing personal opinions as facts. A lot of times they'll bring on someone and they'll say they're an expert, and yet they'll just give opinions, and we must understand that opinions are not necessarily facts. Another way is using words that create an emotional response. The media knows that if they can make the audience emotional, then they will lose some of their reasoning ability. And finally, using misrepresentations to damage the reputation of others. So why would the media use propaganda to manipulate the American people? Well, it says right there in the definition that propaganda is intended to influence an audience in order to further an agenda. The media has an agenda. Now, do you think their agenda is yours or mine? Oh, no, it's not. It's the agenda of their own, and it's usually political in nature. Not only are they trying to further an agenda, but of course they're trying to increase their profits by sensationalizing the news. If something bad happens, they like to make it sound worse than it really is and stir everybody up. Now, when they use propaganda, in effect, that is using psychological tools, psychological techniques to try to trick us. Do you think it's healthy for America to have many in the media using psychology to try to trick and manipulate the American public? I think it is absolutely unhealthy, and not only that, it could be dangerous and cause a lot of harm in some cases, and we'll see evidence of that a little bit later in this episode. But for now, it's time to name names, to call out the ones that are doing this. Not everyone in the media is using propaganda, but there are too many these days that are. So let's take a look and see who are the good guys and who are the not so good guys. This graphic displays the spectrum of media bias, and it comes to us from All Sides Media. It ranges from far left, lean left, center, to lean right, and far right. Now those on the far left and the far right are the most politically biased and most likely to distort the truth, to use psychology to manipulate their audience. Those include, on the far left, CNN and MSNBC, and on the far right, they include Christian Broadcasting Network, CBN, Fox News Opinion, Newsmax Opinion, and OAN. It's highly recommended that we do not use those because they are likely to distort the truth and give us false information. Now those on the lean left and lean right are less biased, but even so we need to use those with caution and be suspicious as to whether they're reporting accurately or not. Those in the lean left category include the major networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC, and lean right includes Fox News. The ones in the center, those are the good guys, the ones that are most likely to be truthful and accurate, such as Newsweek and BBC and USA Today. All right, so now you know who's who in the media. How does the media use psychological techniques to trick us? Well, it turns out there are 9 techniques that they utilize. The first one I call expert opinion. They bring in someone who's knowledgeable, and yet that person just simply gives us their opinion. Now, it's easy to assume that what they're saying is factual, but as I said before, opinion is not fact, and they could easily be wrong. Here's an example. CNN brought in a contributor, and his name is Jason Stanley. He's a Yale professor, so obviously very intelligent. And what he said is this, and I'll quote him. He said, "Trumpism is akin to a fascist political movement." Now, if that's true, then Israel named a city after Donald Trump. So Donald Trump is apparently not a very good fascist if that's the case. It turns out that opinion is totally false. The second technique that is used is what I call pseudoscience. They'll bring someone in and make statements seeming as though they are using science as their basis. For example, someone could say, climate change is normal. For the earth to heat up and cool down, it's a natural cycle, and mankind has nothing to do with it. So mankind is not contributing to global warming. Well, let's take a look at 2 graphs and see if that's true or not. This first graph shows us the carbon dioxide concentration in parts per million going back 800,000 years. Now you can see it generally has been ranging from a little less than 200 parts per million up to about 300. And when it gets down to that lower end, we would see a cooling of the Earth and an ice age cycle. And then it would warm up when the carbon dioxide increased. Carbon dioxide, of course, is a greenhouse gas, and we know that it traps the sun's energy. So it makes sense that the Earth would heat up when the carbon dioxide concentration was higher. But notice what happened at the very end. The carbon dioxide went up to 400 parts per million. And that happened to coincide with the industrial age. You know, the time where we had a lot of factories showing up and we were putting out a lot of gases that way, and automobiles and trucks and so on as well. So clearly, mankind caused the carbon dioxide concentration to go well above the normal range. Now, if we look at this second graph, it only goes back about 2,000 years, but you can see that in general, the temperature of the globe was pretty steady, and they basically set it at 0 for the pre-industrial age. So before the industry showed up, it was generally 2 or 3/10 of a degree Fahrenheit above or below that point. But then recently, once the industrial age starts, and of course once the carbon dioxide concentration shot up, so did the temperature, and it's gone up to above 2 degrees Fahrenheit since then. Folks, I'm a scientist, but you don't even have to be a scientist in order to tell that global warming is a reality. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has been increasing since the industrial age due to mankind, and that has caused the Earth to heat up more than it has been since the last several 100,000 years. So global warming is a reality, and it's been caused by mankind. Anybody that tells you otherwise is not telling the truth. They're using pseudoscience. The third technique that's used in terms of psychology to mislead is what I call telling only one side of the story. Or it could also be described as emphasizing some facts while diminishing others. Here's an example. Here are the pictures of two different people, and my question is, do you recognize either one of them? Most likely, you recognize the person on the left, but not the person on the right. Well, here are their names. The one on the left is George Floyd, and the one on the right is Justine Damon. Now, it turns out they both have a lot in common. For example, they both died in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The circumstances around George Floyd's death is he was arrested for being suspected of passing a counterfeit $20 bill, and Justine called 911 to report that possibly a woman was being assaulted behind her home. In both cases, they were killed by police. George was suffocated and Justine was shot. The officer involved in both cases was convicted of murder. The city of Minneapolis settled with George's family for $27 million and with Justine's family for $20 million. So why is it that the George Floyd story is so well known and yet very few people know about Justine Damon? It's because the media has an agenda. According to their agenda, they wanted to emphasize the George Floyd story and de-emphasize the Justine Damon story. Now here's the part that's pretty concerning. They knew that the George Floyd story was very upsetting. It was an awful situation and tragic. It made a lot of people angry. In fact, it caused unrest, violence, and rioting. There were people who were injured. There were people who lost their lives. There were billions of dollars of property damage, and many businesses were destroyed, burned to the ground. And yet they persisted. They fanned the flames of unrest. That's tantamount to inciting a riot. Apparently, those particular media outlets don't care about you and I. They don't care about the welfare and safety of the American citizen. Instead, they care more about their own agenda. This is a picture of a Minneapolis police station. And as you can see, it's up in flames and the rioters are out there in force. This is the kind of thing that the media was contributing to by continuing to push the George Floyd story. The fourth propaganda technique is character assassination. The media is all too eager to destroy the reputation of anyone who doesn't agree with them. And here are a couple of examples. CNN contributor Areva Martin was talking to radio host David Webb on the telephone, and this was on air. And she accused David of exploiting his white privilege. The only problem with that is David Webb is black. So, oops, she was so eager to trash David Webb, and yet she didn't even know what she was talking about. And here's another example, and this one is really bad. When George Floyd died, Fox News noted that the stock market went up. So they equated that with a good thing. That's really disgusting. They were dragging the reputation of a person who's deceased through the mud. How despicable is that? In both cases, CNN and Fox News apologized, but still, you can see my point. They're ready to drag any reputation down and commit character assassination. The fifth psychological technique is appeal to emotion. You might call this, the sky is falling, the sky is falling. Of course, that would elicit fear, and that's only one of the emotions. Of course, anger is another that we've seen an example of. And here's a report on what might happen due to global warming, scary as it is. They said in 2030, 250,000 people at least every year will die due to global warming if we don't do something about it. 250,000 or more every year. And 100 million people will be forced into extreme poverty in 2030. Now, if that doesn't scare you, I don't know, it scares me. But those claims are unfounded. They're unsubstantiated. The sky is falling. The media is trying to get an emotional reaction out of you, and that way you are less able to reason and realize, now wait a minute, where did they come up with those numbers? So, emotion. And let's get back to our propaganda expert and see what they have to say about using emotion as a technique. They said this: the art of propaganda lies in understanding the emotional ideas of the great masses and finding, through a psychologically correct form, the way to the attention and thence the heart of the broad masses. The sixth psychological technique is what's called conspiracy theory. Now, something that I've noticed is whenever there's a presidential election, it seems like the loser claims that the winner cheated and that there's a conspiracy involved. When Hillary Clinton lost, what was the conspiracy there? Oh, yeah. Donald Trump colluded with the Russians and cheated and stole the election. Turns out, though, after a couple of years of intensive investigation, no basis for that claim was found. So even though it was a theory, it was false. But more recently, Donald Trump lost the election. What was the conspiracy there? Oh, sure, voting fraud. There's a lot of cheating going on, right? Well, there again, that's a theory, and it's been investigated significantly. Now, sure, there are minor examples of voting fraud. That's to be expected, but not nearly enough to overturn the election. So there again, that's just a theory with no sound factual basis. This is another example where some of the media continued to promote a story knowing full well that it would cause anger and unrest. In this case, it culminated in mayhem at our nation's capital. The next technique for psychologically misleading is what's called repetition. And let's go back to our propaganda expert and see what they have to say about that. What they say is all effective propaganda must be limited to a very few points and must harp on these slogans until the last member of the public understands what you want him to understand by your slogan. The eighth psychological technique is known as misinformation. It's where the reporting is filled with a lot of half-truths. Going back to our Gallup poll, 54% of the respondents said that reporters are purposely misinterpreting the facts. And then last but not least, the ninth psychological technique is false reporting, fake news, flat out lies. 28% of our Gallup poll respondents said that the media is making up the facts entirely. Now, with all this propaganda going on, what does it cause? Well, we've seen a lot of examples already. It causes anxiety, it causes fear, it causes division in our country. 84% of the Gallup poll respondents said that the media is responsible for the political division in our country. The media is dividing us. It also causes unrest, anger, violence. We've seen that. It causes defamation, where a person has their reputation destroyed because the media said so. All this can lead to even worse effects. It can lead to a decline of a nation and even loss of freedoms. It's a slippery slope. Propaganda is something that we need to fight against. It's time now to reveal our propaganda expert. That propaganda expert is Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler is known as one of the world's foremost experts in utilizing propaganda. I want to emphasize that I am not saying that the news media are Nazis or fascists or anything of the sort. The point is that propaganda can be dangerous. The Nazis tricked the German people by using propaganda. They tricked them into handing power over to them. And once they received that power, look what they did with it. They became the most evil regime known to man. So what can we do to resist propaganda, to try to avoid being tricked by all these psychological techniques? Well, first of all, we can be wary of any information that we receive from the media, to not take it at face value, but instead to validate it first before we accept it as fact. Second of all, we can become educated about all the psychological techniques that they use. That way, we will be better able to recognize them. And we did this already because we looked at the 9 psychological techniques of propaganda. Now, to further beef up our knowledge of these techniques, what I've done is I've created an assignment for you. Now, it's optional. You don't have to do it if you don't want to, but I think that it will be beneficial. What I've noticed is if you watch or receive news from a source that you tend to agree with, it's harder to recognize when they're pulling the wool over your eyes. So here's the assignment. If you tend to lean more towards the liberal ideology, then watch Fox News for an hour in the evening. And if you tend to be more conservative, watch CNN for an hour in the evening. And during that time, watch for all the psychological techniques that they might use. Down in the comments column, I've created a checklist for you to use. Check them off when you see that they're being used, and I'll bet you during that hour you will see them use several of those techniques. Now, at the start of this video, I promised you that I would give you a recommendation on how to live a little happier life, one with a little less stress and a little less anxiety. And that recommendation is this: we should probably stop watching or taking in news from the more extreme left and extreme right news sources. We've seen that they distort the truth. You know, the sky is falling, things are terrible, there's all of these bad things going on, and it's really upsetting and causes a lot of unrest. And it's causing a lot of division too. So if we watch them less, we should have a better, happier life. Now, along with that, it'd probably be a good idea to communicate that to that news source. If you've been taking your news in from one of those, let them know that you're no longer interested in watching or taking in what they have to say until they straighten up their act. You could tell them that they're causing a lot of problems and division in our country, and you want that to end. Now, in doing so, my hope and wish is that someday the news media can become a healing force in our country, one that is unifying. At that point, just maybe, we can consider the media as champions of truth, justice, and the American way. All right, well, that's all I have for today. Next time, I'm going to be talking about my vision for America. Now, during the first episode of this series, I talked about my vision of America, but I didn't explain how to get there. It's a vision of America that would be a country that is better than it's ever been before. Since then, we've come a long way and gone over many of the things that would need to be done in order to create a country that resembles that vision. So I think it would be very interesting for you to see how we can create a great country, greater than it's ever been before. Please tune in. Well, until next time, God bless you all. Stay safe out there. I'll see you then.